Hash the fatal mistakes when royal romance went wrong. Picture this. You're a princess in the 16th century and you've just been caught passing a love note to someone who definitely isn't on your approved suitor list. Your hands are shaking, your mother-in-law is screaming, and somewhere in the distance, you can hear the executioner sharpening his axe. How did it come to this? You thought you were being so careful. You used invisible ink, you bribed the servants, you even had a foolproof system with your embroidery. But here's the thing about royal scandals. They all start with the same fatal mistakes, the same overconfident blunders that have been bringing down queens and princesses for centuries. Tonight, we're diving into the dark side of palace romance, the moments when everything went catastrophically wrong. These aren't just cautionary tales from dusty history books. These are real disasters that ruined lives, toppled dynasties, and proved that, when it comes to secret affairs, confidence can be just as dangerous as carelessness. So settle in, get comfortable, and prepare to learn from the spectacular failures of royal women who thought they were untouchable. Before we begin this journey through history's most devastating mistakes, take a second to subscribe if you enjoy these deep dives into the messy reality behind the crown, and maybe leave a comment about the worst secret you've ever tried to keep. I guarantee someone in the 1500s tried the same trick and paid for it dearly. Now dim those lights, find your coziest spot, and let's explore the 7 deadliest errors that destroyed palace romances and the women who dared to pursue them. This is a story about human nature, about the universal ways we sabotage ourselves when trying to hold on to something forbidden. It's about the patterns that repeat across centuries, the mistakes we make when we're desperate, in love, or simply trying to claim a piece of happiness in a world designed to deny it. And maybe, just maybe, there's something here we can learn about our own secrets, our own risks, and our own calculations about what we're willing to gamble for a chance at real connection. Let's talk about mistake number 1, the error that brought down more royal romances than any other, trusting the wrong servant. You'd think this would be obvious, right? But time and again, desperate princesses and love-struck queens made the same fatal assumption. They believed that loyalty could be bought with a few coins or secured with threats. They were wrong. Catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. Here's how it always started. You needed someone to carry your letters, someone to stand watch while you slipped out of your chambers, someone to create alibis when questions started flying. So you chose a servant, maybe the sweet-faced maid who always smiled, or the earnest page boy who seemed too innocent to betray anyone. You'd slip them a little money, whisper a few kind words, and convince yourself that you'd secured their silence forever. The problem was that in a palace economy, information was worth far more than gold. Your trusted messenger wasn't just working for you. They were working for everyone who could pay better, threaten harder, or offer more security than you ever could. The betrayal usually came when you least expected it. You'd wake up one morning to find the king demanding to see you, his face purple with rage, clutching a letter you'd sworn had been destroyed. Or you'd walk into the great hall to discover every courtier staring at you with knowing smirks, whispering behind their hands about secrets you'd confided to your maid just yesterday. The servant you trusted had sold you out, trading your scandal for their security, and there was nothing you could do about it. The evidence was already in enemy hands, and your reputation was being shredded before you'd even finished breakfast. The smartest royal women understood this fundamental truth. In a palace, there were no true allies, only temporary arrangements. Every servant had their own survival to consider, their own families to feed, their own futures to secure. Your romance, your happiness, your very life meant nothing compared to their need to stay employed, stay safe, and stay on the right side of whoever currently held power. The moment your secret became more valuable to someone else, you were finished. This wasn't personal. It was economics. Cold, brutal palace economics where betrayal was just good business. Some women tried to get around this by using family servants, people who'd been with them since childhood, who'd braided their hair and soothed their nightmares and sworn eternal devotion. But even family loyalty had limits. especially when the alternative was watching your own children starve or facing accusations of treason yourself. No amount of shared history could compete with raw survival instinct. The most heartbreaking betrayals came from the servants who genuinely loved their mistresses but loved their own lives more. They'd weep as they testified against you, genuinely sorry but absolutely unwilling to go down with your ship. The mathematics of betrayal were simple and brutal. A servant could expect perhaps a few coins for delivering your letters, but reporting those letters to the right people could earn them a permanent position, protection for their family, or elevation to a better role in the household. The cost-benefit analysis wasn't even close. Your generosity, no matter how genuine, couldn't compete with the institutional rewards for treachery. The palace system was designed to encourage betrayal, to make informing more profitable than loyalty, and every servant understood this calculation from their first day of service. What made this mistake so persistent was the illusion of control. You chose the servant. You initiated the arrangement. You set the terms. This feeling of agency was intoxicating and completely false. From the moment you approached that first servant with your request, you'd handed them power over you. They could comply, betray, or do something even more dangerous, pretend to comply while actually working for someone else. You had no way to verify their loyalty, no insurance against their changing allegiances, no recourse if they decided your secret was worth more sold than kept. The really sophisticated operators understood that servants talked to each other. The maid you trusted was sharing gossip with the cook, who mentioned it to the stable boy, who told his mother who worked in the laundry. Even if each individual servant was trying to be discreet, information leaked through the servant network like water through a sieve. By the time your secret had passed through 3 or 4 supposedly trustworthy people, it had been embellished, misinterpreted, and combined with other gossip until it bore only a passing resemblance to the truth. But the damage was done. Once the rumor mill started grinding, accuracy became irrelevant. The lesson here wasn't that you should never trust anyone. That was impossible in a world where you needed help just to get dressed. The lesson was that trust had to be earned through mutual vulnerability, through giving your servants leverage over you that matched the leverage they gave you. The successful conspirators didn't just pay their accomplices. They made them accomplices in truth, sharing enough secrets that betrayal became mutually assured destruction. It was messy, it was risky, but it was the only way to create loyalty that lasted longer than the next bribe. But even this strategy had limits. Mutual vulnerability worked until the stakes got high enough that one party decided their survival outweighed the threat of mutual exposure. When the king himself was demanding answers, when torture or execution became real possibilities, very few servants maintained their silence to protect a mistress they'd helped deceive. The calculus shifted again. Better to confess everything and hope for mercy than to protect a secret and face the full force of royal wrath. The women who understood this built escape plans that didn't depend on servant loyalty. They assumed eventual betrayal and prepared accordingly. Some tried to insulate themselves by using chains of intermediaries, where no single servant knew the full story. The maid knew only that she was delivering letters but not to whom. The page boy knew the destination but not the content. The trusted confidant knew the whole truth but never touched the physical evidence. This approach sometimes worked but created its own problems. With more people involved, there were more potential points of failure. And when the investigation started, each intermediary had incentive to reveal everything they knew and speculate about what they didn't, creating a patchwork testimony that was often more damaging than the simple truth. The cruelest aspect of servant betrayal was how often it came from unexpected quarters. The servant you'd suspected and carefully avoided often remained loyal or at least neutral. Meanwhile, the one you'd trusted implicitly, the one who'd never given you reason to doubt, turned out to be the weak link. Human nature was unpredictable. People cracked under pressure you didn't know they faced, developed resentments you never noticed, or simply made split-second decisions in moments of panic that they later couldn't undo. No amount of careful vetting could protect against the randomness of human behavior under stress. The historical record is full of tragic examples. Maids who betrayed mistresses after years of faithful service because they'd finally been offered something they desperately needed. Page boys who'd successfully delivered hundreds of messages before getting caught with one and immediately revealing everything to save themselves. Confessors who kept secrets for decades before a change in religious politics made silence more dangerous than revelation. Each betrayal followed the same pattern. Trust slowly built, then instantly shattered when circumstances shifted. For modern observers, this mistake offers a clear lesson about the nature of dependent relationships. When someone's livelihood depends on your favor, their loyalty will always be conditional. The power imbalance makes true trust impossible. The servant smiling at you while accepting your bribe might be genuinely grateful, but they're also calculating their options, weighing your patronage against other opportunities, and that calculation can shift in an instant. Understanding this doesn't make you paranoid. It makes you realistic about human nature and the corrupting influence of desperation. But even mutual destruction had limits, which brings us to mistake number 2, underestimating the palace spy network. Every royal woman knew the walls had ears. That was Palace Survival 101. What they consistently failed to grasp was just how sophisticated those ears were, how organized, how relentless. They'd check for eavesdroppers behind tapestries and sweep their rooms for hidden listeners, but they never quite understood that the entire palace was designed for surveillance. The architecture itself was weaponized against privacy. The spy network wasn't some shadowy organization meeting in secret chambers. It was everyone. The laundry maids comparing notes on whose sheets were suspiciously rumpled. The kitchen staff tracking who requested late-night snacks and for how many people. The stable boys memorizing which horses left the grounds and when. The gardeners noting which paths showed fresh footprints each morning. Even the dogs were unwitting informants, their behavior monitored for signs of midnight visitors. Every single person in the palace, whether they realized it or not, was feeding information into an invisible web that caught everything. What made this network so dangerous was its decentralization. There was no spymaster to bribe, no single person to neutralize. Information flowed naturally through the palace hierarchy, passed along in casual gossip that eventually reached someone who understood its value. That comment the maid made about your perfume smelling different lately. It reached the Dowager Duchess within hours, who immediately started watching your waistline. That joke the page boy made about delivering poetry. The king's advisor heard about it before supper and started intercepting your mail. The palace was built to facilitate this surveillance. Servants' passages ran behind every major room, close enough to hear conversations through thin walls. Gallery spaces overlooked private chambers, allowing discreet observation from above. Gardens were designed with strategic sight lines so that apparently private alcoves were actually visible from multiple windows. Even the furniture placement in formal rooms was optimized for monitoring, ensuring that every supposedly discreet conversation happened within earshot of at least one supposedly oblivious servant. Royal women consistently made the mistake of thinking they could control information by controlling a few key people. They'd ensure the guard at their door was loyal, bribe the servant who cleaned their room, and think they were safe. But they forgot about the servant who emptied the chamber pots and noticed unusual patterns. They overlooked the musician who saw everything from the gallery. They never considered that the priest in the confessional might have excellent hearing and a terrible memory for which secrets belonged to which penitent. Every weak link they didn't know existed became the chain that dragged them down. The truly fatal error was underestimating how quickly information traveled. You could have a secret meeting at midnight and find yourself facing accusations before noon. The palace communication network operated at terrifying speed, faster than any official messenger system, because it was powered by the most reliable human motivations: curiosity, self-interest, and the simple joy of knowing something others didn't. By the time you realized your secret was out, it had already made 3 complete circuits of the court and picked up embellishments you wouldn't recognize. The speed of gossip wasn't just about rapid transmission. It was about parallel processing. Multiple people were gathering information simultaneously, each from their own vantage point, and combining their observations. The laundress noticed you wearing the same dress 2 days in a row, suggesting you hadn't returned to your chambers the previous night. The kitchen maid saw someone matching your lover's description, requesting food at an unusual hour. The gardener found disturbed earth near the east gate. Separately, these observations meant nothing. Combined and shared through the servant network, they painted a damning picture that was assembled faster than any single investigation could have managed. Some women tried to fight the spy network with counterintelligence, spreading false information to identify leaks. This occasionally worked but more often backfired spectacularly when the false scandal became indistinguishable from the real one, and suddenly you were defending yourself against accusations you'd invented. The palace gossip mill didn't distinguish between truth and fiction. It amplified everything, and attempts to manipulate it usually just created more noise that drew more attention. Others tried to flood the system with so many rumors that the truth became impossible to identify. This was slightly more effective, but required constant maintenance and eventually collapsed under its own weight, usually at the worst possible moment. You'd spend months carefully cultivating multiple false narratives, each designed to conceal your real activities, and then someone would arrive with actual evidence that cut through all the noise and revealed the truth with devastating clarity. The most insidious aspect of the spy network was how it created a culture of suspicion that poisoned everything. You couldn't trust anyone, even allies, because you never knew who might be reporting your conversations. This isolation made you vulnerable in different ways. Without trusted confidants, you had no early warning system for developing threats. Without the ability to verify information through trusted sources, you were susceptible to manipulation and false intelligence. The spy network didn't just gather information about you. It cut you off from information about the palace, leaving you blind and vulnerable. The network also had a memory that individual spies lacked. Information that seemed harmless when first observed might become significant months or years later when combined with new data. The palace gossip archives, maintained in countless servant memories and informal records, meant that nothing was ever truly forgotten. A comment you made 3 years ago could suddenly become evidence when current events gave it new context. The women who survived understood that the spy network wasn't just monitoring present behavior. It was constantly reanalyzing past actions, looking for patterns that only became visible over time. What really distinguished the successful from the doomed was understanding that the spy network wasn't monolithic. Different factions had different interests and shared information selectively. The servants loyal to one noble house didn't freely share with rival households. Religious factions kept separate intelligence networks. Foreign agents operated independently from domestic spies. This fragmentation created opportunities for those clever enough to exploit it. By understanding the network structure, you could sometimes plant information with one faction that wouldn't reach another, creating pockets of ignorance in an otherwise all-seeing system. The women who survived weren't the ones who beat the spy network. Nobody beat the spy network. They were the ones who accepted its existence and worked around it, assuming every word would be overheard and every action observed. They spoke in codes so complex that even intercepted messages revealed nothing useful. They created such elaborate systems of misdirection that observers exhausted themselves trying to separate truth from theater. Most importantly, they never, ever forgot that in a palace, privacy was an illusion, and the only real protection was making your secrets too boring or too dangerous to share. But there was another category of mistake equally deadly: the physical evidence problem. This brings us to mistake number 3, leaving physical evidence. For brilliant women who could memorize genealogies and negotiate treaties, royal conspirators were shockingly careless about destroying proof of their indiscretions. They'd go to enormous lengths to hide their affairs, then undermine everything by keeping love letters tied with ribbon in their jewelry boxes. It was like planning the perfect crime and then taking selfies at the scene. The evidence took many forms, and all of it was equally damning. Letters were the obvious culprit, those passionate declarations that felt so important to preserve but became devastating weapons when discovered. Women convinced themselves they'd hidden them well, tucked into prayer books, sewn into mattress seams, locked in boxes whose keys they wore around their necks. But palace servants had infinite time and overwhelming curiosity. Every hiding place was eventually found, usually during routine cleaning or after your death when your possessions were cataloged for inheritance. The psychology behind keeping letters was understandable but fatal. These women lived in a world where genuine emotion was rare and precious. The letters represented proof that someone had seen them, really seen them, as people rather than political pawns. Destroying that evidence felt like erasing the relationship itself, like admitting it had never really existed. So they kept the letters, hidden but preserved, telling themselves they were being careful enough. They weren't. In a palace where privacy didn't exist, there was no such thing as careful enough. Then there were the gifts, the tokens of affection that seemed harmless until someone started asking questions. A locket with an unfamiliar portrait, a ring with an inscription in someone else's handwriting, a book with a dedication that didn't match your official correspondence. These objects told stories their owners never intended to share. Smart women refused all gifts or immediately destroyed them, but loneliness and sentimentality made most keep at least one memento. That single piece of evidence was invariably what destroyed them. Gifts were particularly dangerous because they moved through the palace ecosystem. A piece of jewelry might be noticed by a servant and commented on. A book could be borrowed and examined. Even destroyed gifts left traces. The jeweler who created a piece remembered the commission. The bookseller recalled the purchase. Merchants kept records. Every transaction created a paper trail that investigators could follow, and royal investigators had both motivation and resources to follow those trails to their conclusions. Physical evidence extended beyond obvious romantic tokens. There were the clothing anomalies, cloaks muddy in ways that didn't match your stated activities, shoes worn in patterns inconsistent with your official schedule, dresses with tears or stains that required explanation. Servants who managed your wardrobe noticed everything, and their observations fed into the surveillance network. You might think you'd successfully hidden your midnight excursion, but the laundress knew you'd worn your second-best cloak in the rain and would wonder why, and that wondering would be shared and amplified until it became suspicion. There were the food remnants, evidence of midnight feasts when you claimed to be fasting, or wine stains when you'd sworn you were praying. The kitchen kept records of what went where. Missing food was investigated. Unusual requests were noted. Even successful smuggling operations left traces in the accounts and in servant memory. You couldn't eat without creating evidence, and that evidence accumulated over time until the pattern became undeniable. There were even biological traces, the perfumes that lingered where they shouldn't, the scratches or bruises that required explanation, the telltale signs of pregnancy that no amount of loose clothing could hide forever. Your body was evidence, constantly betraying you through its responses and changes. Physicians noticed. Servants noticed. Other women noticed, and they talked. The physical reality of romance couldn't be completely hidden, only delayed in its revelation. What made this mistake so frustrating was how preventable it was. Burning a letter took seconds. Refusing a gift required only a moment of willpower. Yet time and again, women who'd successfully navigated every other aspect of palace intrigue destroyed themselves through simple sentimentality. They wanted proof their romance had existed, something tangible to hold during lonely nights. That very human need for evidence became the evidence that convicted them. The most heartbreaking cases involved women who did destroy most evidence but missed one crucial piece. They'd burn every letter except the first one. They'd refuse every gift except a single pressed flower. They'd maintain perfect discretion except for one embroidered handkerchief. That single exception, that one moment of weakness, was always what investigators found. It was as if fate waited for you to feel safe before revealing the one piece of evidence you'd forgotten about, tucked in a pocket you hadn't worn in months, or hidden in a book you'd loaned to a friend. The search methods were thorough and invasive. When suspicion fell on you, every possession would be examined. Servants would be questioned about your habits and belongings. Rooms would be dismantled, furniture searched, even architectural features investigated for hidden compartments. The investigators weren't looking for obvious evidence. They were looking for anything unusual, anything out of place, anything that suggested secrets. And they usually found something, because maintaining a completely clean evidence profile while living an actual life was impossible. Some women tried to create false evidence trails, planting letters to mislead investigators or staging discoveries of fake evidence. This sophisticated approach occasionally worked, but required meticulous planning and nerves of steel. More often, it created additional problems when the fake evidence was discovered alongside the real evidence, making you look guilty and manipulative. The palace officials might forgive a romantic indiscretion. They rarely forgave elaborate deception that made them look foolish. The really paranoid women destroyed everything compulsively, burning letters immediately after reading, refusing all gifts, maintaining such strict evidence discipline that they left almost no traces. This approach was safer but came with psychological costs. Without any tangible connection to their relationships, they sometimes began to doubt their own memories and experiences. The romance started to feel dreamlike and unreal. Some women eventually wondered if they'd imagined the whole thing, if the affair had ever really happened at all. There was also the problem of selective destruction. You might successfully eliminate all evidence of your affair, but what about evidence of the attempts to hide evidence? Ashes in your fireplace at unusual times, requests for privacy that broke your normal patterns, possessions that mysteriously disappeared. The absence of evidence could itself be evidence of something hidden. Investigators weren't stupid. They understood that unnaturally clean records suggested careful concealment rather than innocence. The survivors learned to live without proof, to keep their romances entirely in memory and shared experience. They communicated through looks and gestures that left no traces. They accepted gifts of time and attention rather than objects. They understood that in a world where everything could be used against you, the only safe evidence was the kind that lived in hearts rather than drawers. It was a harder way to love, more ethereal and less comforting, but it was the only way to love and survive. But surviving the evidence problem wasn't enough if you fell into mistake number 4, perhaps the most ironic, becoming too clever for your own good. The palace was full of women who'd read every romance, studied every historical scandal, and convinced themselves they'd learned from everyone else's mistakes. They created systems so elaborate, so sophisticated, that they felt invincible. This confidence was their downfall. Complexity, it turned out, created more opportunities for failure, not fewer. These women designed codes within codes, backup plans for their backup plans, networks of accomplices so intricate they required written documentation just to remember who knew what. Every layer of security they added created another point of potential failure. Every additional person involved exponentially increased the risk of betrayal. What started as careful planning metastasized into such elaborate schemes that a single error anywhere in the system brought the entire structure crashing down. The codes were a perfect example of overcomplicated security becoming a liability. Simple codes worked because only 2 people needed to remember them. A red rose means midnight. A white lily means danger. Clean, efficient, nearly unbreakable. But ambitious women couldn't leave well enough alone. They created systems where different flowers meant different times, different places, different contingency plans. They added numerical codes based on musical notes. They incorporated astrological symbols and religious references. They created substitution ciphers that changed weekly. The end result was so complex that they themselves sometimes forgot what message they were trying to send. The cognitive load of maintaining these systems was enormous. You had to remember not just the codes themselves, but which version was currently active, which accomplice knew which parts, what backup systems were in place for different scenarios. Under stress, which was basically all the time in a palace environment, this mental overhead led to errors. You'd use last month's code system, or confuse the signals meant for different people, or simply blank on what a particular symbol meant. These mistakes could be catastrophic, sending you to the wrong place at the wrong time or failing to receive urgent warnings. When these Baroque systems inevitably failed, they failed catastrophically. A message meant to say, "Meet me in the East Garden at dawn," got garbled into, "The king knows everything. Flee the country immediately." Women burned crucial letters thinking they were routine correspondence. They showed up for meetings that had been canceled, or worse, didn't show up for meetings that were desperately urgent. The very sophistication that was supposed to protect them created chaos that exposed everything. The multiple identity approach was another clever idea that backfired spectacularly. Women would create elaborate alternate personas, complete with false names, fake backgrounds, and entire invented lives. They'd arrange meetings through intermediaries who didn't know their real identities, leave coded messages in public places signed with pseudonyms, and construct such layers of deception that their lovers sometimes didn't even recognize them. This worked brilliantly until they forgot which identity they were supposed to be using, called someone by the wrong name, or accidentally revealed details that contradicted their invented backstory. Maintaining multiple identities required perfect memory and perfect discipline. You had to remember every detail of every false persona, every claim you'd made, every supposed fact about your invented background. You couldn't slip even once, because a single contradiction would unravel the entire deception. And you had to do this while also managing your real identity, with all its demands and expectations. The mental juggling act eventually overwhelmed even the brightest women, leading to mistakes that exposed not just one affair, but the entire elaborate infrastructure of deception they'd constructed. Technology of the era, such as it was, became another trap for the overconfident. Invisible ink seemed like foolproof communication methods until someone discovered that most invisible inks became visible when exposed to not just specific heat sources, but also several common household substances. Messages written in lemon juice showed up when servants cleaned with vinegar. Notes in milk became readable in humid weather. Messages in onion juice revealed themselves when exposed to certain types of candle smoke. Even the most sophisticated chemical preparations degraded over time, revealing secrets months or years after they were supposed to be safe. The problem with technical solutions was that they required specialized knowledge to use correctly. Women who didn't fully understand the chemistry behind invisible inks made mistakes in preparation or application that rendered the security useless. They'd use the wrong concentration, or apply it to paper that was too porous, or fail to account for environmental factors that would reveal the message prematurely. And because they believed in the technological solution, they often wrote more explicitly than they would have with visible ink, creating even more damaging evidence when the system failed. Timing systems were another source of overcomplexity. Some women developed elaborate schedules for clandestine meetings, with backup times and alternative locations and contingency plans for different scenarios. These systems worked perfectly in theory, but collapsed in practice because they required perfect coordination in an environment where communication was unreliable. Your message about changing the meeting time might not reach your lover in time. Your backup signal might be misinterpreted. Your contingency plan might not account for some unexpected development. The more elaborate the timing system, the more ways it could fail. The fatal flaw in all these overcomplicated schemes was that they required perfection. A simple plan could survive mistakes because there were fewer moving parts to break. You could forget a detail or make an error and still recover. But an elaborate plan collapsed if a single element failed because everything was interdependent. When your security required perfect timing, perfect memory, perfect coordination among multiple accomplices, and perfect execution of complex procedures, you were essentially guaranteeing eventual failure. Humans weren't perfect, and the more you demanded perfection, the sooner someone would make a mistake. The psychological trap was that complexity felt like security. The more elaborate your system, the more clever you felt, the safer you believed yourself to be. This confidence was dangerous because it led to complacency and risk-taking. You'd attempt things with your complicated system that you'd never dare with simpler methods, believing your superior planning protected you. Then, when the system failed, as complex systems inevitably did, you were exposed in ways that simple failures would never have revealed. There was also the problem of explaining complexity when caught. A simple affair could be explained, minimized, sometimes even forgiven. But an elaborate system of codes, false identities, and coordinated deception looked like conspiracy, like treason, like something far more serious than simple romance. The infrastructure of secrecy became evidence of guilty intent, making punishment more severe than the original transgression might have warranted. The cleverness that was supposed to protect you instead condemned you more thoroughly. The women who survived the longest used the simplest methods. They met rarely and briefly. They communicated through gestures and glances that required no interpretation, no codes to remember, no systems to maintain. They involved as few people as possible and kept their systems straightforward enough that stress and fear didn't cause errors. They understood that in a hostile environment, complexity was a vulnerability, not a strength. The best security was the kind that could function even when you were terrified, exhausted, or distracted by the very real possibility of execution. Which leads us directly to mistake number 5, forgetting that everyone else was playing the same game. Royal women often became so focused on their own intrigues that they failed to notice they were surrounded by others running identical operations. The palace wasn't just hostile to your romance. It was a battlefield where dozens of secret affairs, political conspiracies, and personal vendettas were all unfolding simultaneously. Your downfall often came not because someone was targeting you specifically, but because you accidentally got caught in someone else's web. The competitive aspect was real and vicious. Multiple women might be using the same bribed servant, who was then juggling multiple sets of secrets and occasionally mixing them up with predictable results. They might be using the same secret meeting place, leading to awkward encounters, scheduling conflicts, and mutual blackmail. They might be using the same coded language in confession, rendering it useless when the priest couldn't remember which flower code belonged to which penitent. When discoveries happened, guilt was often assigned randomly or to whoever had the most enemies at that moment. You could be completely innocent of the specific accusation, but get caught in the blast radius when someone else's affair exploded. An investigation into one woman's activities might uncover evidence of yours. A servant questioned about one scandal might reveal a different one to deflect attention. A search for one set of letters might turn up yours instead. The interconnected nature of palace intrigue meant that everyone's secrets were entangled, and pulling on one thread could unravel multiple conspiracies. Territory disputes were surprisingly common and surprisingly nasty. Two different couples might try to use the same moonlit garden alcove for their rendezvous, leading to not just awkward encounters, but genuine conflicts over access. Women would discover their supposedly unique embroidery code was also being used by 3 other courtiers, rendering it useless for secrecy and potentially causing dangerous confusion. The priest who seemed like the perfect confidential messenger turned out to be running messages for half the palace, occasionally mixing up letters with predictably disastrous results. The limited resources for secret romance created genuine competition. There were only so many discreet meeting places in the palace, only so many servants willing to be bribed, only so many sympathetic priests or friendly accomplices. Everyone competing for these resources created conflicts and compromises that increased risk for everyone. Some women tried to monopolize resources, buying the exclusive loyalty of key servants or claiming particular locations as their territory. This sometimes worked, but more often just created resentment and competition that made everyone less secure. The women who treated palace intrigue as a cooperative game rather than a solo operation had better survival rates, but cooperation brought its own risks. Sharing information with other conspirators created mutual vulnerability that was both protection and threat. You had allies who could warn you of danger, who could provide alibis and cover stories, who understood your situation because they were in similar ones. But you also had potential witnesses who might save themselves by testifying against you. The balance between cooperation and competition was delicate, constantly shifting, and mistakes in judgment were severely punished. Alliance structures were complex and unstable. You might cooperate with one woman to mutual benefit while secretly undermining another. Temporary alliances formed around shared enemies or common goals, then dissolved when circumstances changed. Information sharing was always partial, never complete. You told your allies enough to maintain the relationship, but held back enough to protect yourself if they turned on you. This constant calculation of how much to trust and how much to conceal was exhausting and error-prone. Some women became so paranoid about competitors that they sabotaged themselves. They'd avoid meeting places because they suspected others were using them, abandoned perfectly good communication methods because they seemed too common, and refuse help from potential allies out of fear they were actually enemies. This isolation made them easier targets because they lacked the early warning systems that came from being connected to palace networks. The most isolated women were often the first discovered because they had no one to alert them when suspicion turned their way. Then there was the zero-sum competition for romantic targets. When multiple women pursued the same man, the rivalry could turn vicious in ways that destroyed everyone involved. Rivals would deliberately expose each other's affairs, plant false evidence to implicate competitors, or even invent scandals from whole cloth. Anonymous accusations would surface. Evidence would be leaked to authorities. Meetings would be sabotaged. The nastiest palace wars weren't between official enemies, but between women competing for the same lover's attention. These conflicts rarely ended well for anyone involved, and often resulted in all parties being exposed and punished. The man at the center of these competitions was often playing his own game, making promises to multiple women, setting them against each other, or simply being oblivious to the chaos swirling around him. His indiscretion or lack of discretion could doom multiple women simultaneously. When he was finally caught or exposed, he'd often try to save himself by revealing everything, producing a cascade of revelations that brought down everyone he'd been involved with. The romantic target became the weakest link, the one point of failure that could expose an entire network of affairs. The successful navigators understood that the palace was an ecosystem where everyone's secrets were interconnected. They built careful alliances based on mutual discretion, where exposing you meant exposing themselves. They stayed aware of others' operations to avoid conflicts and overlaps, maintaining informal territories and respecting others' claims to resources. They shared warning systems and occasionally covered for each other's absences, creating loose networks of mutual protection. Most importantly, they recognized that in a palace where everyone had something to hide, the real enemy wasn't other conspirators but the system itself that made secrecy necessary. But even the best alliances and careful territory management couldn't protect you from mistake number 6, fatal errors in timing. Women would carefully plan every aspect of their affairs, accounting for every variable they could imagine, but they consistently failed to anticipate that scandals had their own schedules. Secrets emerged when they caused maximum damage, regardless of your preparations or readiness. Political timing was particularly treacherous and completely outside your control. Your affair might be tacitly tolerated during peaceful times, with authorities deliberately looking the other way because exposing it served no purpose. But the moment political circumstances shifted, that same affair became a convenient scandal, a weapon to be deployed against you or your family. Rivals waited for the perfect moment to reveal what they'd known for months or even years, dropping bombshells precisely when you were most vulnerable or when exposing you would serve their broader interests. What you thought was a well-kept secret was often a loaded weapon being saved for exactly the right moment to fire. The people who knew about your affair weren't keeping quiet because they were loyal or discreet. They were waiting for the moment when revelation would be most profitable, most damaging, most useful to their own agendas. Your secret was currency they were saving for when they really needed to spend it. The worst revelations came during transitions of power. A king's death, a succession crisis, a shift in political alliances. These were moments when old secrets suddenly became useful ammunition. Affairs that had been quietly acknowledged for years, that everyone knew about but nobody mentioned, were suddenly grounds for treason charges. Women who'd felt secure under one regime found themselves completely exposed under the next. The protection you'd bought or inherited, the network of allies who'd kept your secrets safe, all of it evaporated overnight when the palace power structure shifted. New rulers often wanted to establish authority by prosecuting scandals from the previous administration. Your affair became their opportunity to demonstrate moral superiority or eliminate potential rivals. Religious and moral panics created similar timing disasters. A shift in religious policy or the rise of a reform movement could suddenly make previously tolerated behavior into serious crimes. Affairs that had been dismissed as typical courtly romance became evidence of moral degeneracy requiring punishment. Women found themselves prosecuted not for breaking new rules, but for violating standards that hadn't been enforced when they'd actually committed the acts. The retroactive nature of these prosecutions made them particularly cruel and impossible to defend against. Personal timing was equally unpredictable and completely outside your control. Pregnancies operated on their own biological schedule, indifferent to whether you were politically secure or your affair was safely hidden. You might successfully conceal an affair for years, only to have pregnancy force revelation at the worst possible moment, during a political crisis or family emergency when discovery would be most damaging. The body had its own timeline that didn't care about your strategic planning. Illnesses created similar problems, requiring physicians who asked too many questions, who noticed things that servants might have missed, who had medical reasons to examine you closely. A minor illness at the wrong time could reveal a pregnancy you'd been hiding. A serious illness might require calling in doctors who weren't part of your conspiracy, who didn't know which secrets to keep. Even recovery from illness created timing problems, as changes in routine or appearance required explanation. Aging introduced its own timing catastrophes. Affairs that were barely tolerated when you were young became scandals when you were older. The same behavior that was dismissed as youthful indiscretion in your 20s became evidence of unseemly behavior in your 40s. Double standards around age and gender meant that older women faced harsher judgment and more severe consequences for the same actions that younger women might have escaped with minor censure. The timing of discoveries was often completely random, driven by coincidences and accidents rather than investigation or betrayal. A servant might stumble onto evidence while cleaning. A letter might be delivered to the wrong room. A chance encounter in a hallway might reveal what months of careful planning had hidden. These random discoveries were the hardest to defend against because they came without warning and often involved people who weren't even looking for evidence. You couldn't anticipate or prevent pure bad luck, Anniversary effects created their own timing disasters. The palace had an institutional memory that tracked important dates, births, marriages, deaths. If your affair resulted in a pregnancy, the timing between conception and birth would be scrutinized and compared to official records. Babies born suspiciously early or late raised questions. Children who resembled the wrong parent became evidence. These biological timelines created permanent records that couldn't be erased or explained away. The compound timing problem emerged when multiple events converged. An affair might survive a political transition or a religious shift, but rarely both simultaneously. When personal crises coincided with political instability, when pregnancy aligned with a change in regime, when illness struck during a moral panic, the combination of factors overwhelmed even the most carefully constructed defenses. Women found themselves facing multiple crises at once, unable to manage them all, and the affair that had survived individual challenges collapsed under the weight of combined disasters. Some women tried to control timing by choosing when to reveal their own secrets, confessing before discovery, or negotiating surrender on favorable terms. This strategy sometimes worked, especially if the revelation came at a moment when authorities had bigger problems or when confession could be leveraged into some kind of deal. But more often, voluntary revelation just meant earlier punishment. The fantasy of controlling the narrative through selective disclosure rarely survived contact with palace politics, where narratives were controlled by those with power, not those with secrets to confess. The most sophisticated operators built flexibility into their plans, creating exit strategies for different scenarios and avoiding commitments that locked them into specific timelines. They maintained multiple escape routes, had resources hidden away for emergencies, and cultivated relationships outside the palace that could provide refuge if necessary. They understood that in palace life, the question wasn't if your secret would be revealed but when, and the smart ones made sure they controlled that when rather than having it control them. But even the best planning could only mitigate timing disasters, not prevent them entirely. Finally, we come to mistake number 7, the ultimate error that brought down even the most careful conspirators: believing your own performance. After months or years of pretending everything was normal, playing the role of dutiful daughter or faithful wife or proper princess, many women started to believe they actually were safe. They'd survived so many close calls, navigated so many dangers, that they convinced themselves they were untouchable. This confidence, this belief in their own invincibility, led to the small slippages that ultimately destroyed them. The performance fatigue was real and incredibly dangerous. Maintaining a false front every waking moment was exhausting in ways that are hard to overstate. You had to monitor every expression, weigh every word, control every reaction, all while pretending to be relaxed and natural. This constant vigilance consumed enormous mental and emotional energy. Over time, the effort required to maintain the performance became unbearable, and everyone eventually slipped. The only question was when and how badly. The slip started small. You'd forget to maintain your facade for a moment, letting your real feelings show when you thought nobody was watching. But somebody was always watching. You'd react too strongly to something that shouldn't have mattered to your official self, revealing interests or knowledge you weren't supposed to have. You'd smile at the wrong person, or fail to smile at the right one, or let your gaze linger a moment too long on someone you were supposed to barely know. These tiny cracks in the facade were like blood in the water for the palace sharks who'd been circling, waiting for exactly this kind of mistake. The confident women were especially vulnerable to these slips because they'd convinced themselves they were good enough actors to risk moments of authenticity. They'd think, just this once, just for a second, I can let my guard down. But that second was all it took. The Dowager Duchess who'd been watching you for months caught that unguarded moment, and suddenly everything clicked into place for her. The months of vague suspicion crystallized into certainty, and she began building her case with new energy and focus. Some women became victims of their own success. They'd hidden their affairs so well that, when hints emerged, the contrast between their reputation and the reality made the scandal worse. The most publicly virtuous women suffered the harshest punishments when exposed because their fall seemed like a greater betrayal. If you'd built your entire public persona around piety and propriety, your affair wasn't just personal misconduct. It was hypocrisy, deception, a fundamental betrayal of the values you'd claimed to embody. The higher your pedestal, the more satisfying your fall was to the audience. This created a cruel paradox. To avoid suspicion, you needed to maintain an impeccable reputation. But the more impeccable your reputation, the more devastating any revelation would be. Some women tried to navigate this by cultivating a slightly flawed persona, minor improprieties that made them seem human without being actually scandalous. This provided some protection by lowering expectations and making potential revelations less shocking. But it was a delicate balance, and most women either maintained too perfect a facade or damaged their reputations too much in the attempt to seem flawed. The performance also created identity problems that manifested as mistakes. After years of playing a role, some women began to lose track of which version was real. They'd internalized the performance so thoroughly that their authentic self became buried and inaccessible. This led to bizarre errors where they'd act according to their false identity even when they should have been authentic, or vice versa. They'd forget what they were supposed to know or not know, what they were supposed to feel or not feel. The cognitive dissonance became paralyzing. Memory problems compounded the performance failures. You had to remember not just the facts of your affair but also what you claimed to remember, what you were supposed to know, which version of events you'd told to which people. Over time, this became an impossible mental burden. You'd contradict yourself without realizing it, telling slightly different versions of the same story to different people. When these contradictions were noticed and compared, they revealed the underlying deception. The physical toll of constant performance manifested in ways that betrayed you. The stress showed in your face, your posture, your health. People commented that you looked tired or worried or unlike yourself. These observations, innocent in themselves, contributed to a growing sense that something was wrong. The palace learned to read stress as evidence of secrets, and your inability to maintain a perfectly serene exterior became its own kind of revelation. Some women cracked under the sustained pressure, making catastrophic errors in judgment when their mental reserves were depleted. They'd do something completely out of character, something that couldn't be explained by their official persona, in a moment of exhaustion or desperation. They'd snap at a servant they should have placated, or break down crying when they should have remained composed, or make a decision that only made sense if you knew about their hidden life. These pressure release moments were often the beginning of the end, the first thread that investigators pulled to unravel everything. The belief in their own performance led some women to take increasingly risky actions. They'd think, "I've gotten away with so much already. What's one more risk?" This escalation was gradual enough that they didn't notice how far they'd pushed beyond the boundaries of caution. They'd start by bending minor rules, then breaking more serious ones, convinced that their perfect record proved they were safe. But each transgression increased the statistical probability of discovery, and the accumulated risk eventually overwhelmed their luck. The performance trap was also psychological in a deeper sense. The effort of maintaining a false self created such internal division that some women began to sabotage themselves unconsciously. Part of them wanted to be caught, wanted the exhausting charade to end, wanted the relief of having everything out in the open regardless of the consequences. This self-destructive impulse manifested in seemingly inexplicable mistakes, in keeping evidence that should have been destroyed, in taking risks that made no logical sense. The unconscious desire for resolution overcame conscious self-preservation. There was also the problem of performing for too many audiences. You weren't just deceiving the palace authorities. You were deceiving your family, your supposed friends, your official allies, and even yourself. Each audience required a slightly different performance, and keeping track of which version to use with which people became impossible. You'd slip and use the wrong performance for the wrong audience, revealing to one group something that only another group should know. These cross-contamination errors exposed the multi-layered nature of your deception. The women who survived longest were the ones who never fully believed in their own safety. They maintained their vigilance even after years of success, treating each day as if discovery was imminent. They never relaxed their guard, never convinced themselves they were truly untouchable. This constant anxiety was psychologically costly, but it kept them alert to dangers that overconfident women missed. Paranoia in moderation was a survival trait. But even paranoia had limits. The truly cautious women sometimes paralyzed themselves with fear, unable to act or make decisions because every option seemed fraught with danger. They'd become so risk-averse that they couldn't maintain their affairs at all, or they'd make different kinds of mistakes driven by fear rather than overconfidence. The psychological sweet spot between overconfidence and paralysis was nearly impossible to maintain over extended periods. The lesson woven through all these mistakes was brutally simple. In a royal palace, there were no perfect crimes, only crimes that hadn't been punished yet. The women who survived weren't necessarily the smartest or the most careful. They were often just the lucky ones whose secrets emerged at moments when revealing them served no one's interests, whose rivals had bigger targets to focus on, whose scandals were overshadowed by larger events, who happened to outlive everyone who knew the truth. As we close this catalog of catastrophic errors, remember that these weren't just historical mistakes. They're timeless lessons about power, secrecy, and survival in hostile environments. Every woman who tried to find love or freedom within oppressive systems faced these same challenges, made similar mistakes, and paid similar prices. Some lost their lives, some lost their freedom, some lost their families, and all lost pieces of themselves in the constant struggle to be human in situations designed to deny their humanity. The historical record is remarkably consistent about what destroyed palace romances. It wasn't usually dramatic betrayals or spectacular failures. It was the accumulation of small errors, the compound effect of minor slippages, the way that tiny mistakes built on each other until the structure collapsed. One servant slightly more interested than usual, combined with one piece of evidence not quite destroyed, combined with timing that was slightly off, combined with a moment of overconfidence. These factors didn't cause disaster individually, but combined, they created cascades of discovery that no amount of planning could prevent. What made these mistakes so persistent across centuries was their psychological basis. They weren't failures of intelligence or planning. They were failures of human nature. The need to trust somebody, the desire for tangible evidence of love, the tendency to create complex solutions to difficult problems, the inability to remain vigilant indefinitely, these are fundamental aspects of being human. Palace life didn't create these vulnerabilities. It simply punished them more harshly than normal life did. Modern readers might feel superior, thinking we've moved beyond such primitive surveillance and restrictions. But the fundamental dynamics remain. We still struggle with whom to trust, what evidence to keep, how complex to make our security systems, when to reveal secrets, and how long we can maintain performances of ourselves that don't match our inner reality. The technology changes, the specific constraints shift, but the human elements stay remarkably constant. We're making updated versions of the same mistakes, just with different tools and different consequences. The other consistent lesson is about power and its relationship to privacy. These women's affairs became scandals not because romance was inherently wrong, but because their lack of power meant they couldn't control their own lives or narratives. Men in similar situations often faced far lighter consequences or escaped punishment entirely. The double standard wasn't a bug in the system. It was the system, designed to control women's autonomy and sexuality in ways that male autonomy and sexuality weren't controlled. The mistakes that destroyed these women often wouldn't have been mistakes at all for men in similar positions. So as you drift off tonight in your modern world with your privacy laws and your encrypted messaging, spare a thought for those who came before. Learn from their mistakes. Admire their courage in trying to claim some piece of happiness despite impossible odds. And be grateful you don't have to hide your heart behind embroidered flowers or trust your love letters to a page boy who's already working for your worst enemy. Be grateful you can make mistakes without risking your life, even if the consequences can still be painful. But also recognize that while the specific mistakes may be historical, the underlying dynamics are eternal. People still betray trust for personal gain. Surveillance still exists, just in different forms. Evidence still accumulates and reveals what we'd prefer to hide. Complexity still creates more problems than it solves. We still compete with others for limited resources and opportunities. Timing still matters in ways we can't control. And we all still struggle with the exhaustion of maintaining the gap between our public personas and our private realities. The royal women who made these mistakes weren't foolish or careless. They were people trying to navigate impossible situations with imperfect information and limited options. They made the best choices they could with the resources available to them. That their best wasn't good enough speaks to the cruelty of the systems they lived within, not to their own inadequacy. Each mistake was, in its own way, an act of hope. Hope that this time they'd succeed, that this risk was worth taking, that love or freedom or simple human connection was possible even in the most hostile environment. Their failures teach us not just what to avoid but what to admire. The willingness to risk everything for a chance at authentic connection. The creativity and intelligence devoted to solving impossible problems. The resilience to keep trying despite repeated failures and devastating consequences. The fundamental human refusal to accept that oppressive systems should define the limits of our emotional lives. These women lost their battles, but their willingness to fight them at all is worthy of respect. Sleep well, dream of simpler times, and remember, the palace walls had ears, the servants had prices, and somewhere in that magnificent, terrible machine, a woman just like you was making her first fatal mistake. The only question was which one it would be, and whether she'd live long enough to realize what had gone wrong. Sweet dreams, and may your own secrets stay safer than theirs ever did. May you never have to choose between love and survival, between authenticity and safety, between being fully yourself and staying alive. And if you ever find yourself making similar mistakes in your own modern context, at least you'll understand that you're in excellent historical company, following in the footsteps of women who dared to want more than their world was willing to give them. Good night.